A world-famous pilot simply vanished into the blue sky, her last words crackling over the radio. A celebrated writer was found incoherent in a gutter, dressed in strange clothes, days before he died. 2 royal children, locked in a tower, disappeared without a trace, their fate debated for centuries. An unknown man was discovered on a quiet beach. A coded message, his only clue, his identity, still a blank. History is full of endings, but some goodbyes are more like question marks, leaving us wondering what really happened. Number 7. The Somerton Man. The code in his pocket, and no name. Imagine a warm summer evening, December 1st, 1948, on Somerton Beach, near Adelaide, South Australia. The waves are lapping. People are enjoying the cool air. Then, a discovery. A man lying on the sand, propped against a seawall as if resting. He was well-dressed, in a suit and tie, shoes polished. But he wasn't resting. He was dead. Police arrived. There were no obvious signs of violence, no struggle. In his pockets they found a few everyday items. An unsmoked cigarette resting on his collar, as if it had fallen from his mouth. A used bus ticket to a nearby suburb. An unused second-class rail ticket from Adelaide to Henley Beach. A narrow aluminum American comb. A half-empty packet of juicy fruit chewing gum. An army club. Send a small box of Bryant and May matches. An army club. And a small box of Bryant and May matches. What was missing was far more telling. No wallet, no money, no identification whatsoever. Who was this man? The mystery deepened. His fingerprints didn't match any on record in Australia or internationally. His dental records were unique, but unidentifiable. An autopsy was performed. Pathologist, Dr. John Dwyer, noted a congested liver, spleen, and brain. His stomach contained blood, and he had a pasty meal in his last hours. Dr. Dwyer suspected poisoning, possibly by a fast-acting, hard-to-trace substance like digitalis or astrofenthin, but tests were inconclusive. Coroner eventually concluded he died from an unknown poison, but couldn't say if it was accidental, suicide, or murder. His heart, the coroner noted, was normal and not diseased. The police kept digging. They found that all the labels on his clothing had been meticulously removed. One small clue emerged. A tailor's label on a tie read, T. Keene. Public appeal for anyone knowing the missing T. Keene yielded nothing concrete. Months later, on January 14, 1949, staff at the Adelaide railway station cloakroom found an unclaimed brown suitcase. It had been checked in on November 30, 1948, the day before the body was found. Inside was a collection of clothing, including a dressing gown, slippers, pajamas, and a stenciling brush of the kind used by sailors to mark cargo. Some items had the name Keene or T. Keene on them, but like the clothes on the body, other labels were removed. One coat was found to have American stitching, suggesting he might have spent time in the United States. The most baffling clue was yet to come. Professor John Cleland, who re-examined the body's clothing in April 1949, found a tiny rolled-up piece of paper hidden deep in a fob pocket of the man's trousers. It was printed with 2 words, Tamám Shud. Experts identified this as a Persian phrase meaning, "It is ended," or "finished," famously from the last page of The Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, a collection of poems. A nationwide police appeal was made to find the specific copy of the book from which this scrap was torn. A man came forward. He revealed that after reading an article about the case, he recalled finding a rare edition of Fitzgerald's translation of the Rubaiyat in the back of his unlocked car, which he had parked near Somerton Beach, around the time the body was discovered. He hadn't thought much of it until he saw the appeal. When police examined this book, they found the last page, where Tamám Shud should have been, was torn out. Even more intriguing, in faint pencil markings on the back cover or an inside page, accounts vary slightly, were 5 lines of capital letters. They looked like a code. WRGOABABD. Despite efforts by naval intelligence and amateur cryptographers, this code has never been definitively deciphered. Was it a secret message, a list, or just random jottings? The book also contained a very faint indentation of a phone number. This led police to a woman named Jessica Thompson, a nurse who lived in Glenelg, a suburb near Somerton Beach. When shown a plaster cast bust made of the Somerton Man's head and shoulders, Thompson reportedly appeared startled, even completely taken aback, to the point of giving the appearance that she was about to faint, according to the detective who interviewed her. However, she denied knowing the man, or why he would have her phone number, or be in her neighborhood. She also owned a copy of The Rubaiyat, but said she had given one as a gift during World War II to an army lieutenant named Alfred Boxall. This seemed like a breakthrough. Could the Somerton Man be Alfred Boxall? Police located Boxall, alive and well, and he still had his copy of The Rubaiyat, complete with Tamám Shud on the final page. So, the book found in the car was not Boxall's. Jessica Thompson's connection remained enigmatic. She told police she didn't want her name associated with the case to avoid scandal. Years later, her daughter would claim her mother knew more than she let on, suggesting a possible Cold War espionage link, as Thompson spoke Russian, but never disclosed where she learned it. The Somerton Man was eventually buried in Adelaide's West Terrace Cemetery in June 1949, under a headstone that read, "Here lies the unknown man who was found at Somerton Beach." For decades, his identity, his cause of death, and the meaning of the code remained complete blanks. In 2022, UNA research by Professor Derek Abbott, using hair found in a plaster cast, suggested the man might be Carl Charles Webb, an electrical engineer and instrument maker from Melbourne, born in 1905. This identification is based on genealogical DNA, matching. But how he died and why he was in Somerton, with no ID and a coded message, remains unsolved. The mystery of Tamám Shud continues to fascinate. Number 6. Louis Le Prince, the cinema pioneer who vanished from a train. Long before Hollywood, before flickering movie screens became a global pastime, a brilliant inventor named Louis Aime Augustin Leprince was on the verge of changing the world. In 1888, in Leeds, England, he used his single-lens camera to capture what many consider the first true motion pictures, short sequences like Roundhay Garden scene and traffic crossing Leeds Bridge. He was a pioneer, a visionary, racing to perfect and patent his cinematic invention. Then he disappeared. It was September 1890. Le Prince had been in France, visiting his brother Albert in Dijon. He was filled with excitement and anticipation. His plan was to return to England, gather his family, and then sail to New York. In America, he was scheduled to publicly demonstrate his groundbreaking motion picture camera and projector, and crucially, to secure his American patents. This trip was supposed to be his moment of triumph. On September 16, 1890, Louis Le Prince, along with his luggage containing his precious camera designs, and perhaps even film, boarded a train in Dijon bound for Paris. His brother Albert saw him off at the station, confirming he got on. Friends were waiting in Paris to meet him. The train journey from Dijon to Paris was a few hours, a routine trip. But Louis Le Prince never arrived in Paris. When the train pulled into the station, he wasn't on it. His friends searched, but he was gone. His luggage, which he would never have willingly parted with, was also missing. The French police, along with Scotland Yard, launched an extensive investigation. They searched the train carriages. They scoured the railway line between Dijon and Paris. The train had made no unscheduled stops. The windows of Le Prince's compartment were reportedly found closed and latched from the inside, though some accounts dispute this detail, suggesting a window might have been open. No trace of the prince or his belongings was ever found. It was as if he had evaporated into thin air from a moving train. How could a man and his luggage simply vanish from a sealed, moving train carriage? The lack of any body, any evidence of a struggle, or any sign of him leaving the train at an intermediary stop, which would have been noted, baffled everyone. Naturally, theories began to circulate, though none could be proven. His family vehemently denied the possibility of suicide. Le Prince was reportedly in good spirits, financially stable, and on the cusp of international recognition. He had everything to live for. Why would he choose that moment to end his life, and in such a way that his body was never recovered? Foul play seemed more plausible to some. The world of invention in the late 19th century was fiercely competitive. Le Prince was not the only one working on motion picture technology. Thomas Edison in America was a formidable competitor, aggressively pursuing his own cinematic patents. Could rivals have wanted Le Prince out of the way to clear their path to dominance in the burgeoning film industry? The idea of an invention, theft, murder was whispered, but no evidence ever surfaced to support such a dramatic claim against Edison or any other specific party. Some even speculated about family disputes. There were unconfirmed rumors of arguments with his brother over their mother's will, though Albert Le Prince was the one who confirmed Louis boarded the train and seemed cooperative with the investigation. Another far-fetched idea was that Prince, perhaps deeply in debt or wanting to escape some unknown personal problem, orchestrated his own disappearance to start a new life. But this clashed with his well-documented plans and excitement for the New York demonstration. Le Prince's wife Lizzie and his son Adolphe continued to believe he had been murdered due to his invention. Adolphe even testified in an American patent case years later, defending his father's claim as the true inventor of cinematography. Tragically, Adolphe himself died in mysterious circumstances a few years after this, shot dead on Fire Island, New York, though his death was officially ruled a suicide. Without Le Prince to demonstrate his camera and secure his patents, his claim to being the father of cinematography faded into relative obscurity for many years, overshadowed by the subsequent successes of others like the Lumiere brothers in France and Thomas Edison in the United States. In 1930, Le Prince was legally declared dead in absentia. The mystery of his disappearance remains one of the strangest in the history of invention. No body, no ransom note, no witnesses, no clear motive for murder that could ever be substantiated. Just an empty seat on a train and a future that vanished with him. How does a man simply cease to exist between two railway stations? Number 5. Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. The genius silenced too soon. Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. The name itself sings of genius, of child prodigies, of symphonies, operas, and concertos that have enchanted the world for centuries. Composed over 600 works, many acknowledged as pinnacles of classical music, all before his untimely death at the age of just 35. The final act of his life is shrouded in almost as much legend and mystery as his music is filled with brilliance. Mozart died in his Vienna apartment on December 5, 1791. The official cause of death recorded in the Vienna magistrates' records was Hitziges Freiselfieber, which translates to heated miliary fever or sever miliary rash fever. This was a somewhat general diagnosis at the time, referring to a fever accompanied by a rash of small millet seed-sized blisters. His final illness began in Prague in September 1791, where he had gone for the premiere of his opera, La Clemenza di Tito. He felt unwell, but recovered enough to return to Vienna and continue working, most notably on his famous Requiem Mass. However, in late November, his health took a sharp decline. Accounts from his wife, Constance, his sister-in-law, Sophie Heibel, and others who were present describe a range of distressing symptoms. Severe swelling of his hands and feet, then his entire body, making it difficult for him to move, vomiting, pain, and a persistent rash. He remained conscious for much of his illness but grew progressively weaker. Almost immediately after his death, rumors began to fly. The most persistent and sensational of these was that Mozart had been poisoned, and the name most often linked to this dark accusation was Antonio Salieri, a contemporary composer and the imperial Kapellmeister at the Viennese court. Salieri was a respected and successful musician, but popular legend, greatly fueled by later plays and films like Amadeus, painted him as a jealous rival consumed by Mozart's superior talent. Did Mozart himself believe he was poisoned? According to accounts from Constance, Mozart did express such fears in the final weeks of his life. He reportedly told her, "I feel definitely that I will not last much longer. I am sure that I have been poisoned. I cannot rid myself of this idea." He even supposedly said that the requiem he was composing was for himself. This unfinished requiem, with its somber tones and themes of death and judgment, only added to the dramatic narrative. The Salieri poisoning theory gained traction over the years. There were reports that decades later, in his old age and suffering from dementia, Salieri confessed to murdering Mozart. However, these reports are considered unreliable by most historians, likely stemming from the ramblings of a very ill man or misinterpretations by those around him. Salieri's two nurses and his doctor at the time denied he ever made such a confession. While the poisoning narrative makes for a dramatic story, most modern medical historians and musicologists look to natural causes to explain Mozart's death, though they don't always agree on which one. Over 100 different diagnoses have been proposed retrospectively. Some of the leading contenders, based on the described symptoms, include acute rheumatic fever. This was a common and often fatal illness in the 18th century, and its symptoms, fever, rash, joint pain, swelling, align well with accounts of Mozart's final illness. He had suffered from bouts of rheumatic fever earlier in his life. Kidney disease, caremia. The severe swelling, edema, Mozart experienced is a hallmark of kidney failure. Some believe a chronic kidney condition could have led to his death. Henoch-Schönlein purpura. This is a rare vasculitis, inflammation of blood vessels, that can cause a rash, joint pain, abdominal pain, and kidney problems. Some researchers believe this fits the symptom profile quite well. Strep throat infection leading to post-streptococci glomerulonephritis. A severe strep infection could have led to kidney complications that proved fatal. An epidemiological study of deaths in Vienna at the time suggested an epidemic of an illness that could match this. Trichinosis. This parasitic disease, contracted from eating undercooked pork, which Mozart reportedly enjoyed, can cause fever, muscle pain, and swelling. Other less common theories include influenza, mercury poisoning, from treatments for syphilis, though there's no strong evidence he had syphilis, or even a subdural hematoma from a fall. Adding to the mystique was Mozart's burial. He was not thrown into an unmarked pauper's pit, as the romantic myth often suggests. He received a third-class funeral, which was common for Viennese citizens of his social standing. This meant he was buried in a common grave, not an individual one, at the St. Mark's Cemetery outside Vienna. As was the custom for such graves, after a number of years, the plot was dug up to make way for new burials, and the exact location of his remains was lost. This lack of a specific final resting place contributed to the air of mystery surrounding his end. So, was Mozart a victim of a jealous rival's poison plot, or did he succumb to one of the many diseases prevalent in 18th century Vienna? The lack of definitive medical evidence, from the time, the conflicting accounts, and the sheer drama of his genius, cut short, mean that the precise cause of Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart's death will likely continue to be debated and speculated upon, a final unresolved cadence to an extraordinary life. Number 4. Alexander the Great. Conquered by what? Alexander the Great. By the age of 30, he had forged one of the largest empires the ancient world had ever seen, stretching from Greece to northwestern India. He was a military genius, a Nidic leader, undefeated in battle. But in June of 323 BC, at the height of his power and aged only 32, Alexander was conquered not by an enemy army, but by a sudden mysterious illness in the city of Babylon. The story of his final days comes to us from ancient historians like Arrian, Plutarch, and Diodorus Siculus, though their accounts were written centuries after his death and sometimes differ in details. What they generally agree on is that Alexander fell ill after a prolonged banquet and drinking party hosted by his friend Medius of Larissa. The symptoms began with a fever. Soon, he experienced sharp abdominal pains, growing weakness and chills. Over the next 10 to 12 days, his condition steadily deteriorated. He developed a high, unremitting fever. He lost his ability to speak. Eventually, he became paralyzed, though he reportedly remained conscious until near the end. On either June 10th or 11th, 323 BC, in the palace of Nebuchadnezzar II in Babylon, Alexander the Great died. What caused the swift demise of this seemingly invincible young conqueror? Question has puzzled historians and scientists for millennia. The two main categories of theories are poisoning and natural causes. The poisoning theory was popular even in antiquity. Alexander had many powerful enemies, and his vast empire was rife with political intrigue and ambitious generals who stood to gain from his death. Potential suspects were numerous. Some pointed fingers at Antipater, the regent Alexander had left in charge of Macedon, whom Alexander had recently summoned to Babylon, possibly to be disciplined or replaced. Antipater's son, Cassander, arrived in Babylon shortly before Alexander's illness. Could they have plotted to poison him? Aristotle, Alexander's former tutor, was also sometimes implicated, as he had connections to Antipater. The supposed poisoner in many accounts was Alexander's royal cupbearer, Iolaus, another son of Antipater. If it was poison, what substance could have caused such symptoms and a relatively slow death over several days? Various toxins have been proposed: arsenic, strychnine, or hellebore. One intriguing modern theory, put forward by Dr. Leo Shep from New Zealand's National Poison Centre, suggests Veratrum album, commonly known as white hellebore. This plant, when fermented into wine, could produce a poison that would match the prolonged and painful nature of Alexander's illness, including the abdominal pain and muscular weakness, without being instantly fatal. The ancient Greeks were certainly aware of its properties. However, many historians lean towards natural causes. Babylon was a city where diseases like malaria and typhoid fever were rampant. Malaria, transmitted by mosquitoes, certainly could cause high fevers and chills. Alexander had spent considerable time in swampy, mosquito-infested regions. Typhoid fever, caused by Salmonella typhi bacteria, spreads through contaminated food and water and causes high fever, weakness, abdominal pain, and sometimes a rash. This also aligns with some of the described symptoms. West Nile virus is another candidate, proposed more recently. This virus, also spread by mosquitoes, can cause fever, headache, body aches, and in severe cases neurological complications like encephalitis or paralysis. Historians have noted that ancient accounts mention a flock of ravens behaving strangely and dying before Alexander fell ill, which could be consistent with an epizootic event associated with West Nile virus, as birds are carriers. Guillain-Barré syndrome, GBS, is a fascinating recent theory. This rare autoimmune disorder, where the body's immune system attacks its nerves, can cause progressive paralysis, difficulty breathing, and if misdiagnosed in ancient times, could lead to someone being declared dead prematurely if they were profoundly paralyzed but still mentally aware. Proponents of this theory suggest Alexander might not have been truly dead when he was prepared for burial, which could also explain the ancient accounts that his body did not show signs of decomposition for several days after his death. This lack of decay was seen by his followers as a sign of his divinity, but could have been because he was not yet deceased, or due to the nature of his illness, or perhaps even early embalming techniques. Other possibilities include pancreatitis, potentially brought on by his documented heavy drinking, or even a perforated bowel leading to peritonitis. Alexander had not named a clear successor. When his generals asked him on his deathbed to whom he bequeathed his kingdom, he supposedly whispered, "Toi kratis toi," to the strongest. Whether he actually said this, or if it was a later invention, is debated. His death immediately triggered a chaotic power struggle among his generals, the Diadochi, which led to decades of war and the fragmentation of his vast empire. The mystery of Alexander's death is compounded by the loss of contemporary records, such as the royal diaries or ephemerides, which supposedly chronicled his daily activities and health. We rely on later interpretations and copies. Without his body for modern forensic analysis, his tomb's location is one of history's other great mysteries, though he was initially entombed in Memphis, Egypt, then possibly Alexandria. The exact cause of death remains speculative. Was it a fever from the marshes of Babylon, a tainted cup of wine, or something else entirely that brought down the mighty Alexander? The world may never know for sure. Number 3. The Princes in the Tower. Royal blood, silent walls. In the turbulent summer of 1483, England was on edge. King Edward IV had died unexpectedly, leaving his 12-year-old son Edward to inherit the throne as King Edward V. The young king, along with his 9-year-old brother Richard, Duke of York, became central figures in a power struggle that would end in their disappearance. Following King Edward IV's death in April 1483, his younger brother, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, was named Lord Protector of the young King Edward V and the realm. Young Edward was brought to London ostensibly to prepare for his coronation. He was lodged in the Tower of London, which at the time served as both a royal residence and a state prison. In June, he was joined there by his younger brother, Richard of York. Things took a dark turn. The Lord Protector Richard of Gloucester began to consolidate his power. A clergyman named Ralph Shaw preached a sermon declaring that King Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville, the prince's mother, had been invalid because Edward IV had allegedly been pre-contracted to marry another woman, Lady Eleanor Butler. If the marriage was invalid, then Edward V and Richard of York were illegitimate, and therefore ineligible for the throne. With this claim, Parliament issued the Titulus Regius, an act formally declaring Gloucester the rightful king. On July 6, 1483, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, was crowned King Richard III. Meanwhile, The two young princes remained in the Tower of London. Initially, they were seen playing in the Tower Gardens. But as the summer wore on, sightings became less frequent. Then, sometime after mid-1483, they vanished from public view entirely. They were never seen alive again. What happened to Edward V and Richard of York? The immediate assumption, both then and for centuries after, was that they were murdered, and the prime suspect was their uncle, King Richard III. He certainly had the motive, with the boys alive. They remained a threat to his reign, potential rallying points for his enemies. He also had the means and opportunity, as the boys were under his control in the tower. Many contemporary and near-contemporary accounts, particularly those written after Richard III was overthrown, pointed the finger squarely at him. Sir Thomas More, writing about 30 years later, though drawing on sources closer to the events, provided a detailed and influential account claiming Richard III ordered their deaths, tasking Sir James Tyrrell with carrying out the murders. According to More, the boys were smothered with pillows in their sleep and buried secretly within the tower. However, much of the historical narrative accusing Richard III was shaped by Tudor historians writing under the reign of Henry VII, the man who defeated Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth Field in 1485 and established the Tudor dynasty. It was in the Tudors' interest to blacken Richard III's reputation to legitimize their own claim to the throne. While Richard III is the traditional villain, other suspects have been proposed, though with less direct contemporary suggestion. Henry Stafford, 2nd Duke of Buckingham. He was Richard III's closest ally during his seizure of power. However, in autumn 1483, Buckingham led a rebellion against Richard III. Some have speculated that Buckingham might have killed the princes perhaps on Richard's orders and then used their deaths to try and discredit Richard, or perhaps on his own initiative to clear a path for his own ambitions. Buckingham also had a distant claim to the throne. Richard III accused Buckingham of the crime after his rebellion. Henry VII, Henry Tudor. After he became king in 1485, Henry VII married Elizabeth of York, the prince's eldest sister, uniting the houses of Lancaster and York. While he had a motive to eliminate rival claimants, the princes disappeared in 1483, 2 years before Henry took the throne. For Henry to be responsible, the princes would have had to survive Richard III's reign, only to be killed later by Henry. There's little evidence to support this, although some revisionist theories entertain it. There's also the slim possibility that one or both princes were smuggled out of the tower and survived, living in hiding or under false identities. Several individuals later claimed to be Richard, Duke of York, most famously Perkin Warbeck in the 1490s, who gained considerable support in Europe before being captured and executed by Henry VII. Most historians believe these claimants were impostors. A dramatic discovery in 1674 seemed to offer physical evidence. Workmen undertaking renovations in the Tower of London, while demolishing a staircase leading to the chapel in the White Tower, found a wooden chest containing the skeletons of 2 children. The location roughly matched the area where Thomas More had claimed the princes were buried. Believing them to be the remains of Edward V and Richard of York, King Charles II had the bones interred in an urn in Westminster Abbey. These bones were re-examined in 1933. The examination concluded that the skeletons were those of 2 children whose ages corresponded roughly to those of the princes at the time of their disappearance. However, the 1933 methods could not definitively confirm their identity, sex, though presumed male, or cause of death. No signs of violence were reported on the bones themselves, which would be consistent with smothering. Requests for modern forensic analysis, including DNA testing, which could potentially be compared to DNA from other known relatives, have so far been denied by the Church of England and the royal household. Without definitive forensic proof or a contemporary confession, or unassailable eyewitness account of their fate. The mystery of the princes in the tower endures. Were they murdered by their ambitious uncle? Were they victims of other political machinations? Or did they somehow escape their stone prison? The silence from the Tower of London over 5 centuries ago continues to echo with unanswered questions. Number 2. Amelia Earhart. Lost in the Pacific Blue. Amelia Earhart was more than just a pilot. She was an icon, a symbol of adventure, courage, and female empowerment in the early 20th century. She was the first woman to fly solo across the Atlantic Ocean, and she set numerous other aviation records. In 1937, she embarked on her most ambitious journey yet. To become the first woman to circumnavigate the globe by air, she almost made it. On June 1, 1937, Earhart and her experienced navigator Fred Noonan departed from Miami, Florida, heading east in their twin-engine Lockheed Model 10E Electra. They successfully completed over 22,000 miles of the journey, crossing the Atlantic, Africa, India, and Southeast Asia. By late June, they reached Lae, New Guinea. Only about 7,000 miles remained, all of it over the vast, empty Pacific Ocean. The next leg was one of the most challenging, a 2,556-mile flight from Lae to Howland Island. Howland Island is a tiny, uninhabited coral islet, barely 2 miles long and half a mile wide, a mere speck in the immensity of the Pacific. The U.S. Coast Guard cutter Itasca was stationed near Howland, tasked with providing weather information, radio contact, and a radial beacon to help Earhart and Noonan find the island. On July 2, 1937, Earhart and Noonan took off from Lae. The flight was expected to take about 18 to 20 hours. Throughout the flight, the Itasca attempted to maintain radio contact. Earhart's transmissions were sporadic and often difficult to hear. She reported cloudy weather and headwinds. As dawn approached on July 2nd, Howland Island time, which was across the international dateline, radio communications indicated they believed they were close to Howland. At 7:42 a.m. local time, Earhart radioed, "We must be on you but cannot see you, but gas is running low. Have been unable to reach you by radio." A little later, at 7:58 a.m., she reported, "We are circling but cannot see island, cannot hear you." The Itasca was sending signals, but Earhart apparently couldn't receive them clearly or couldn't use her radio direction finder effectively. Her last confirmed voice transmission was at 8:43 a.m. "We are on the line 157-337. We will repeat this message. We will repeat this on 6,210 kilocycles. Wait." This line likely referred to a line of position, a navigational calculation meaning they believed they were somewhere along a line running northwest, 157 degrees to southeast, 337 degrees from Howland Island. After a brief pause, another transmission, possibly from Earhart, was heard. "We are running on line north and south." Then silence. An immediate and massive search was launched by the U.S. Navy and Coast Guard, concentrated in the vicinity of Howland Island. Ships and aircraft scoured over 250,000 square miles of ocean. No trace of Earhart, Noonan, or their Electra aircraft was found. After 16 days, the official search was called off on July 19, 1937. Amelia Earhart and Fred Noonan were declared legally dead in 1939. What happened to them? The enduring lack of definitive evidence has spawned numerous theories. Crash and sink theory. This is the most widely accepted and official explanation. It posits that the Electra, unable to locate Howland Island and running critically low on fuel, simply crashed into the ocean and sank. The Pacific in that area is thousands of feet deep. Finding wreckage would be incredibly difficult. especially with 1930s technology. The challenges of navigating to such a tiny target with the equipment of the day were immense, even for an experienced navigator like Noonan. Radio problems and cloudy weather would have made it even harder. The Gardner Island, Nikomaroro, theory. This theory suggests that Earhart and Noonan, unable to find Howland, spotted another uninhabited atoll, Gardner Island, now Nikomaroro, part of Kiribati, about 350 nautical miles southeast of Howland. They might have made a forced landing on the island's flat coral reef. Proponents, notably the International Group for Historic Aircraft Recovery, TIGHAR, have mounted multiple expeditions to Nikomaroro. They have found artifacts that they believe could be linked to Earhart and Noonan, such as fragments of what might be aircraft aluminum, pieces of a woman's shoe consistent with Earhart's size and style, a sextant box similar to Noonan's, and possible evidence of castaway campfires. Shortwave radio distress calls, weak and garbled, were reportedly heard by radio operators across the Pacific for several days after the disappearance. Some researchers believe these signals could have originated from Nikomaroro, if Earhart managed to operate the Electra's radio for a time after landing. Skeletal fragments found on the island in 1940 were initially dismissed, but later, analysis of the records, as the bones themselves were lost, suggested they could have belonged to a woman of European descent and Earhart's approximate build, though this is highly debated. The Japanese capture theory. This more sensational theory claims Earhart and Noonan veered significantly off course, perhaps due to navigational error or even on a secret espionage mission for the US government, a claim for which there's no solid proof. They supposedly landed in the Marshall Islands, or Saipan, which were then under Japanese control. According to this theory, they were captured by the Japanese military, accused of spying, and eventually died or were executed in captivity. This theory relies heavily on scattered, often contradictory, and uncorroborated eyewitness accounts from islanders or former Japanese servicemen decades after the event. No official Japanese or US government records have ever substantiated it. Despite decades of searching, countless books, documentaries, and expeditions, no undisputed wreckage of the Electra has ever been found, and no definitive proof of Earhart's and Noonan's final fate has emerged. Amelia Earhart, the courageous aviator who soared to global fame, simply vanished into the vast Pacific sky, leaving behind a mystery that continues to capture the public imagination. Her last known words, full of uncertainty but not panic, echo through history. "We are on the line, we are running online, and then nothing." Number 1. Edgar Allan Poe. Madness, mystery, or murder? Edgar Allan Poe, master of the macabre, architect of the detective story, poet of haunting beauty and profound sorrow. His life was as turbulent and tragic as many of his tales, and his death in 1849 at the age of 40 is one of literature's most enduring and perplexing mysteries. The circumstances surrounding his final days are so strange, so lacking in clear explanation, that they could have been plotted by Poe himself. On October 3, 1849, a man named Joseph W. Walker, a compositor for the Baltimore Sun newspaper, found Poe in a state of severe distress outside Ryan's Saloon, also known as Gunner's Hall, which was being used as a polling place for a local election in Baltimore. Poe was described as delirious and incapable of taking care of himself. He was wearing cheap, ill-fitting clothes that were clearly not his own, a soiled, tattered shirt, a worn-out alpaca coat, and an old straw hat. He was semi-conscious and unable to explain how he had arrived in such a condition or where his own clothes were. Walker, recognizing the famous writer despite his disheveled state, sent an urgent note to Dr. Joseph E. Snodgrass, an acquaintance of Poe's. The note read, "Dear Sir, there is a gentleman, rather the worse for wear, at Ryan's Fourth Ward polls, who goes under the cognomen of Edgar A. Poe, and who appears in great distress, and he says he is acquainted with you. He is in need of immediate assistance. Poe had been missing for 5 days. He had left Richmond, Virginia on September 27th, intending to travel to Philadelphia to edit a collection of poems for a Mrs. St. Leon Loud. He briefly stopped in Baltimore en route. What happened to him between his known departure from Richmond, or his last sighting in Baltimore on the 27th or 28th, and his discovery on October 3rd, is a complete blank. Dr. Snodgrass, along with Poe's uncle by marriage, Henry Herring, arranged for Poe to be taken to Washington College Hospital. There, he was attended by Dr. John J. Moran. Poe remained in a state of delirium, suffering from vivid hallucinations and reportedly calling out repeatedly for a name, Reynolds. He was never coherent enough to explain what had befallen him. On the morning of Sunday, October 7th, 1849, Edgar Allan Poe died. His official cause of death was listed as phrenitis, inflammation of the brain, or sometimes cerebral inflammation. Vague terms that in the 19th century often meant the doctors simply didn't know the true cause. The mystery of Poe's death lies in those missing days and the bizarre circumstances of his discovery. Numerous theories have been proposed over the years. Alcoholism. Poe had a well-documented lifelong struggle with alcohol. He was known to be extremely sensitive to it, with even small amounts, sometimes sending him into binges or erratic behavior. Dr. Snodgrass, a staunch temperance advocate, immediately assumed Poe had died from a fatal drinking bout. This became the widely accepted story for many years. However, Dr. Moran, the attending physician, consistently stated that Poe had no odor of alcohol on his breath when admitted to the hospital, nor did he have the tremors associated with alcohol withdrawal. Moran also said Poe refused alcohol when offered it in the hospital. Cooping. This is one of the most intriguing and plausible theories. Cooping was a violent form of electoral fraud, common in the 19th century. Unwary victims would be kidnapped by political gangs plied with alcohol or drugs, like laudanum, and then forced to vote multiple times at different polling stations, often being made to change clothes or wear disguises to avoid detection. Ryan's Saloon, where Poe was found, was indeed a polling place. And it was election day. This could explain his delirious state, his strange, shabby clothing, and his inability to remember what happened. He could have been drugged, abused, and then abandoned, once he was no longer useful. Mugging and beating. Poe could have been robbed and assaulted, sustaining head injuries that led to his delirium and eventual death from cerebral inflammation or a related complication. Baltimore was a rough port city. Brain tumor. Some have speculated, based on accounts of Poe's headaches and behavior in his later years, that he might have suffered from a brain tumor. A sexton who exhumed Poe's body in 1875 for reburial in a more prominent spot anecdotally claimed to have heard a mass rattling inside Poe's skull. But this is highly unreliable second-hand evidence. No autopsy at the time of death recorded such a finding. Rabies? In 1996, Dr. R. Michael Bennett proposed rabies as a cause of death. He pointed out that Poe's symptoms, periods of confusion and delirium, alternating with lucidity, hallucinations, refusal of water, hydrophobia, which could have been mistaken for refusing alcohol, and rapid deterioration, are consistent with rabies. If bitten by a rabid animal weeks or months earlier, the disease could have manifested during his travels. Influenza or other diseases. Epidemics of diseases like cholera or influenza were common. Poe could have contracted a severe infection that led to his symptoms. Carbon monoxide poisoning from faulty heating or lighting has also been suggested. Heavy metal poisoning, like mercury or lead, has been considered, given the medical treatments of the era, but there's no direct evidence. The Reynolds he called out for remains a mystery. Could have been Jeremiah N. Reynolds, an explorer whose Antarctic adventures influence Poe's novel The Narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym of Nantucket. Or it could have been Henry R. Reynolds, an inspector at the polling place where Poe was found. Or someone else entirely. Complicating matters further, many of Poe's personal papers and medical records from the hospital were lost or destroyed. Furthermore, Poe's literary reputation was immediately and viciously attacked by his literary executor, Rufus Wilmot Griswold. Griswold, who bore a grudge against Poe, wrote a slanderous biographical sketch portraying him as a depraved, drunken madman. This heavily biased account shaped public perception of Poe for decades and may have obscured or distorted the facts surrounding his death. Poe's mother-in-law, Maria Clem, who knew him well, always maintained that he did not die of drunkenness. The true story of Edgar Allan Poe's final days is a puzzle with too many missing pieces. Was he a victim of his own addictions, a political crime, random violence, or a hidden illness? The strange clothes, the lost time, the desperate cries for Reynolds, these fragments of a shattered narrative, leave us with only questions. The master of mystery left behind one of his own, a final, unsolved tale.